Good afternoon, everybody. I'm gonna just give a couple extra minutes. I know we had some scheduling confusion, so I want to give folks some time to settle in, but I'll get going here in just a few minutes. But I'm Chris Ippolite, and this is going to be FileMaker and APIs and other stuff. Well, all right. How's everybody feeling today? Excited? Anxious? Nervous? All right. Well, if you're interested in hearing somebody talk about APIs, you've come to the right spot, although you've been hearing a lot about that today. I promise that there'll be a theme that will be running through this that will be very familiar to you. My name is Chris Ippolite. I'm actually really proud to be presenting right here today, this afternoon, my 45th DevCon session. I can't believe it. That's just this week, actually. But actually, the reason I'm proud of that is that I really enjoy speaking at DevCon for a couple of reasons. But really the main reason I enjoy this is because I think it's fun to show people ways to extend their FileMaker custom apps beyond standard functionality. And really, there's no better way to extend our apps than through APIs. I mean, really, that's what we're doing by definition. And so today, this is going to be a really interesting ride that we're going to go on here this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about how FileMaker can consume and integrate with other APIs. Now, I promise you I will stick around afterwards. I'll stand out in the hallway, and I'll sit there all afternoon if you want to ask me questions and talk about this. Some of the answers I won't have, I'll tell you that right now. But for every other question that you have, I'll meet you out there. And the reason I want to do that is because I have so much stuff I want to share with you, and all the good stuff's at the end. So I beg you, even if a couple of the things that you're seeing at the beginning are something maybe that you've seen before, stick around. I've got some surprises for you. And we'll have a fun time with this thing here this afternoon. So what I'm going to actually show you, I'm going to start off our session this morning with just a brief discussion about what APIs are. I'm pretty sure everybody in the room knows what they are and understands what they are. But just in case this has been kind of flying by you all day, and you're wondering to yourself, what are these things, APIs anyways? I'm going to spend just a few minutes at the beginning making sure that we level set the room, that everybody knows where we're at. And then quickly what I'm going to do is go into sort of what I like to think is sort of the inspirational section of the presentation. I'm going to show you some real applications that I've created that integrate with APIs. They're undetectable within the workflow within FileMaker, but I want to show you some of the cool stuff that you can do. Then I'm going to actually spend a few minutes showing you the basis, sort of the baseline elements that you're going to need to know so that you can do this yourself. As a matter of fact, I have a file that I'm going to show you later that is going to be available to you on a website that I'll download later. Actually, it's up on the conference materials as well, too. I'm going to show you how easy it was for me to integrate that particular one, but we got a little bit lucky in that one. So after that point, we'll have some interesting things occur here, actually, today. So hang in there for sure. So forgive me for those of you that are well-versed in API, but I'm going to speak to a few folks here that maybe are still trying to understand what all this is. But let me just take a moment to talk a little bit about APIs and kind of set the room of what it is that we're discussing. I'll move through this very quickly because nobody likes slides, especially this guy. So let's get started. First of all, the most basic thing is APIs stand for Application Programming Interface. You may be already familiar with this, but one way to think about APIs is that they're an intermediary between two or more software applications that don't speak the same language. And kind of to further this don't speak the same language metaphor, let's say, for example, you're a traveler in another country where the locals there don't speak your same language. Well, what you would want to have in that case is a translator that can do that speaking for you. You'd speak to the translator. They would then turn it into the language that the locals understand, and then the locals would then speak to that same translator so that you guys are virtually communicating. By the way, this is the same thing that's happening when you plug your laptop into a printer and you have to have a driver because laptop and printer don't speak the same language either. It's really the same principle that we're talking about here. So now previously, kind of in the early years of all this, FileMaker, or would be a translator, and we'd have to do API integrations using things that were like, for example, we'd use PHP or XML or different things like that. Nowadays, APIs have certainly matured quite a bit. So now the role that FileMaker plays is kind of interesting. come along with me on this imaginary journey here where we're talking about integrating FileMaker and Etsy together. Who's heard of Etsy before? Oh, good. Well, this demo's going to land then for sure. So let's pretend that you have a bustling Etsy page and you've been selling FileMaker jewelry, Claris jewelry up on Etsy this whole time, and it's really taken off. But at the same time, you've got this FileMaker application that's handling all sorts of things like contact management and marketing and that type of thing. So in FileMaker, you can use what's called an Etsy API to actually send a request for data to Etsy. So let's say the problem you might be solving there, of course, is I've got all these orders and receipts that are being generated through Etsy, and right now I'm having to download them from their website and import them into FileMaker. Well, in this case, we can have them communicate with each other. And the primary construct that we're using when we're having any apps communicate with each other, and we're going to specifically focus on FileMaker and others, is that URL call that's happening. I'm going to show you a URL. I'm going to talk about it a little bit. This is really kind of the baseline of how the communication works. And then the second part of it is that the application that has the API that we're communicating with is actually going to respond, and it's going to respond with JSON. We've all heard of JSON, right? We probably all heard of JSON because in recent versions of the FileMaker application, we were given native ways to parse out this data. And this is why that was so important, because all these APIs that we're going to talk to are going to speak back to us in JSON. I'll show you some and show you that it's really not that daunting. So really, this kind of an exchange could be as simple as you just asking one question of a piece of data and making it so you don't have to import something, or you could build these into really complex workflows. And I'm going to show you some of those workflows when we get into the demonstration part here in just a few minutes. But the way I like to look at this, and the way I like to approach APIs, and the reason I'm excited about having this in our ecosystem, is I like to think of letting FileMaker do FileMaker, and letting Etsy do Etsy. For example, I could have just built an entire store into FileMaker if I want. We certainly know that that's possible. But why do that when there's already another thing out there that's doing it? So I can just have those two things talk to each other. I think about it as sort of like functionality off the shelf, sort of on a marketplace where I can just go look around and say, well, gosh, do I want a store online? Do I want emailing capabilities? Well, I'll take a little bit of that and a little bit of this and so on, and then integrate it into our existing solutions. And it's really easy to retrofit our solutions to do this as well, too. So let's do an example of that. So let's say we'll further this a little bit. I've been talking about how FileMaker is using Etsy to do the selling of all our fancy jewelry. But now let's say we want to add mass emailing strategy. Of course, yes, we could build mass emailing functionality native into our FileMaker applications, but why do that? We know that there's applications out there that have industry-grade tools to do that, like MailChimp, for example. We've been hearing a lot about that today, and frankly, you're going to hear a lot more this afternoon. So the idea is, well, I need this mass emailing. Why don't I just then connect to the MailChimp API and have it do that for me? I like to call that grabbing that functionality off the shelf. So really, this mindset really should help you innovate faster, because you're not going to spend all this time basically, if you know the functionality is already there, let's just start with that functionality and spend our energy trying to make the connections. And that's really going to be kind of the theme of what I'm going to be sharing with you today, particularly in the second half of this session. How much energy are we spending? How many calories are we burning making those connections? Because as long as we can think about the innovation, and if it's not too difficult for us to make the connection, then we're in a really interesting world at this point. So now let me talk just briefly, just to kind of let you know what possibilities there are, because you've been hearing a lot about MailChimp and probably the same 5 APIs all day today. But for those of you that want to get kind of an idea of how many there are out there, this is just a small sampling. But the idea is you could have one FileMaker application connected to multiple different APIs, tons of them. It could be the hub of your entire ecosystem within your organization. So let me actually put some real numbers on this for you. There's this, I've shared this last year, so don't worry. A lot of the stuff is going to be fresh for you here as we go. But that's a lot of APIs. Just to give you some perspective, this site called Programmable Web, they're sort of like the main registry for APIs out there. So back in 2010, they had about 2,000 total APIs in their registry. Now, the astonishing thing is, they're currently up to over 20,000 of those things. Just for some perspective, in 2010, they only had 2,000, and ever since 2014, they've been adding 2,000 a year. And I'm pretty sure that this has been updated since earlier this summer when I actually took this snapshot. So it's really growing aggressively. And the good thing is these aren't a ton of different languages that we have to learn. They all are responding with JSON. You're all speaking to them using URL calls, and they all have documentation out there. That's essentially what defines what an API really is. So this is why you're hearing a lot of that theme this week about this is where everything's going. Let's get on board. Let's be part of this, because there's so much opportunity out there. So what I want to do now is, well, do you guys want to see 20 more slides? All right. Well, then let's go into some demos instead. How's that? So the demos that I'm going to share with you are a couple of different stories. I've shared this one before, but it's a good one. And this is actually the file that you're going to be able to download on the link that I share with you later. It's a books app. And for those of you under 25, books are things that we used to print and read. I know I'm super relevant with that one. But anyways, the next one we're going to show is, these are all apps that I actually use myself. This is a dog walking app that I actually use to track the walks with my dog. I'll get into that a little bit. And then I'm going to show an example of a digital asset management system. And what the heck, let's do one more. I've got this one that's a real estate app, which is, the story there is that a realtor is using this. So let me actually start first with, let's do digital asset management. So let me tell you the story here with the digital asset management app. This is an application that's built in FileMaker, and a lot of, I'm kind of hoping that the lines are blurry between what FileMaker is doing and what the APIs are doing, because that's really what my point is here. So what the purpose of this application is it's storing assets, and FileMaker is handling a lot of things like recognizing who the users are when they log in, and it's taking them directly to assets that were assigned to them. It's also handling things like version control and approval, and some various other items here too. So the checking out and the checking in, this is all FileMaker stuff. So what's actually happening here, as far as the story is concerned, is we've got Bob. Bob just logged into this digital asset management system in FileMaker, and he's going to go do some really compelling artistry on this poster. And when he's done, he has to actually check this one in so that Susan, his boss, can approve it, or Susan's his manager. And Susan needs to approve it as quickly as possible, because their differentiator as a business is that they are really quick on turnaround. So what's important to them is that they make sure that this finished version that gets approved by the manager gets over to the client as quickly as they can. So what I want to point to is where the APIs actually start to come in here. So you'll notice that I've got this little button down there that's called Request Approval. So I check in the asset. It doesn't actually version that asset into the master until Susan approves it. So Bob is going to go in here, and he's going to click Request Approval. Now, FileMaker's doing FileMaker things at this point. And the thing about Susan is that she's not at her desk much. She's really busy. So sometimes she even works from home, and she's not even logged into FileMaker, or even her email for that matter. But one thing she's in all the time is Slack. How many of you guys use Slack? And that's why she's using that quite a bit, right? So Slack happens to have an API. It's a really popular one, actually. So this way, Susan happens to be on her iPad. She's not connected to FileMaker Pro or email or anything. But we're using FileMaker to communicate with Slack, and Slack is sending this custom message. Now, you'll notice in the custom message that it says a few things. It talks about what the project is and what version of the asset it is, and it was Bob that was sending it. And it also has a little URL in there. That's a kind of obfuscated FMP URL. So as you guys probably know, FMP URLs are ways that we can send a message to FileMaker to open up a file and run a script. So basically, when Susan interacts with this custom message that's being sent through the Slack API, then she will actually open up FileMaker, and as you'll see here in a second, it's going to take her directly to the asset that she needs to approve. So we'll do a little Touch ID. She logs in. The script that was run through that Slack message takes her right to this design. So now here comes the room for another API. So really this is what it's about, multiple different APIs all kind of working together. So right now you haven't seen much that looks different from usual FileMaker working, but here's another problem that we need to solve. Sometimes in our containers we can have really large assets being stored there, right? All the way up to 4 gigabytes in some cases. So what we want to do is deliver this to the client, but what if this attachment that we're going to send is potentially a gigabyte in size? That's probably not going to work. So instead what we're doing is we've attached a box.com API to this so that Actually, that little blink that you're seeing in the screen is us communicating with Box.com. So what we just did is move the asset out of the container over into a Box.com folder that's set up just for this customer. And then Box.com communicates back to FileMaker. And if you see that URL that's sitting there in the middle, that's one of Box.com's specific URLs. So we said, hey, Box, here's a file. Go put it up in the client folder at a certain location where we want you to. And then when you're done doing that, come back with a confirmation and also give us the URL that we can send off to our client. So we're back in FileMaker, and FileMaker is now sending this email, and it's sending off to the client so that we can make the client's deadline. So you'll see here the client can then receive it's just Box stuff that we're looking at now. The client receives the email, they click on the link, and then they can then download that file from Box. So I'm going to get back to that story a little bit later with another API integration. But basically what you looked at there was Bob makes a change to an asset. FileMaker uses Slack API to send a notification to Susan. She then interacts with the notification, opens FileMaker to approve the changes, and then FileMaker uses the Box API for delivery of really any size type asset. Does that make sense so far? How about more? Yes? Okay. Just talking to myself up here. So now let's say that you're a realtor. And a realtor, of course, has a couple of different assets that are important to them. Listings that they're managing, and then potential home buyers that they have relationships with. So in this case, this realtor uses mobility by taking their iPad with them. And so they hear that the Joneses in their neighborhood are interested in selling their home. So before anybody else gets that listing, they want to grab their application under their arm and their iPad and take that all the way over to whatever the coffee shop is where they're meeting the Joneses. So now in this database, they don't have a database of every single potential listing in America, but we're going to use an API to be able to pull information right away. So even if they don't know the address, they sit down with the Joneses, enter in the address into the database, and when we enter in the zip, you see something kind of magical happen. So what happened here was we actually took all the address information and pushed it out to a Zillow API. Who knows Zillow? That's the thing that tells you that your house isn't worth as much as you think it is, right? The other thing that you're getting here in the middle is a URL that we got back that's actually something I'm presenting in a web viewer. And I mean, look at this kind of functionality that it looks like we're creating from scratch. But this is really just Zillow sending us a URL that says, here's all the comps in the area. So the user can actually interact with our FileMaker application to learn more about some of these comps. And the purpose of this, of course, is that the Joneses, we're trying to convince the Joneses that they should probably come up with a certain asking price based on those comps. So now we're back into FileMaker things. The Joneses say, yeah, we're going to probably list for about $500,000. So at this point now, the FileMaker piece did a little query, and it found all the different buyers that this realtor has a relationship with that might be interested in a home in the range of $500,000. So now what we want to do is actually communicate with these folks. How about we use MailChimp in this case? You've heard a lot about that today. Let me kind of show you how that might work. Well, one of the things that was happening behind the scenes is that there's, whenever we create a new record in FileMaker, we actually go and create what's called it's actually called an audience now, but it used to be called a list in MailChimp. Let me pause for a minute here and just explain that I'm showing you a split screen of the MailChimp app on an iPad and FileMaker on the left-hand side. I just want to be really clear that it is not necessary at all that MailChimp be on this device. These are two servers talking to each other, okay? So you don't have to have MailChimp available on FileMaker at all. As a matter of fact, these things can happen as server-scheduled items behind the scenes without any clients logged in at all. Just want to make sure. I'm just doing this for the visuals so you can kind of see some of this stuff happen. So we see already that the Jones list was added, and now what we want to do is we want to pick buyers from this list and add them to this list so that we can send out information about an open house. So we've, and there you can see right now there's no contacts currently in the list. And now what we do is we hit each one of these Add to List buttons, which are FileMaker scripts that are running, communicating with the MailChimp API. So we're going to add Alan, Elliot, Jonah, and we'll throw Priscilla in there as well, too. So now you'll see after we add the last one, and those blinks are about the time it takes for that communication to happen. Now you see those 4 are added to the list. So now that we've actually got them added to the list, we're going to then find the date that we can have on the open house. So the realtor can use the Google API to check their calendar to see what their next open date might be. And it's going to present that date. And as we see, it's lucky Friday the 13th, unfortunately. So now what we're going to do is actually enter in data into FileMaker. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, why wouldn't I just enter this into the calendar? Well, this event is related to this home, and so now we can capture all that data right inside FileMaker so that we can manipulate it and use it strategically while still being able to add stuff to our calendar. So you'll see that when we're done adding the record for the event here, all we have to do is add new event to Google, and you'll see in what was real time how quickly it gets added. And again, here you don't have to have Google on the same machine. These are all happening server to server. So we hit the button, it thinks for a little bit, and then it adds the event to Google. And you see that all the different attributes that I added in there are also present. So now at this point, let's say the realtor runs into somebody at another coffee shop that says, hey, I hear the Jones are selling their houses. Can I take a look at that? And they go, well, actually, yeah. I've actually got my FileMaker application integrated with the Google Maps API, and I can have it look down the street and actually put it on a perspective detail map as well. Yeah, that's pretty much what 500 grand gets you in California, is what you're looking at right there. So in summary, what we've actually done there is we've got a realtor adding a listing. Zillow then creates a list for them. And then we're able to add individuals to that campaign so that they can contact them through MailChimp. And then we even are using Google Calendar, for adding that event to the calendar. And then it shows up on all your devices, and they can invite people. And then at the end, we even use Google Street View to be able to show people what it might look like on the street level. So again, in that case, there's actually 3 different APIs all worked into that workflow. Another story I'm going to show, some may in fact recognize this application because when FileMaker released GetSensor, I did a video for the FileMaker website that demonstrated GetSensor, which I think is a really cool a set of functionality. And what it does is it allows you to track steps and distance and all sorts of other really neat stuff. So when I was trying to think of a story on how I could do this, I came up with building a dog walking app. So then I could go out while I'm walking the dogs and see how many steps that I was able to get. So when I first did the demo for GetSensor, I would track it, and then at the end it shows all the different steps that you've got. And then when I was using this in real life, something really strange happened. A very odd phenomenon occurred. It rained a couple times in Southern California, and I was very confused, and so were my dogs. So I thought, let me go to another app and see if there's going to be rain in my area and so on. What I came across was an interesting API. It's called the Climacell API, and you guys can check this out later on, or I'll give you a resource where you can actually go to their API. And it gives like micro weather, like IoT-driven, really cool localized weather. So I could actually go into my application and say, what's the average distance from my starting location that I usually walk? And how long does it take me to walk that distance? I then take that information, send it over to an API, and it comes back and says, well, in the average time it takes you to go on this dog walk, it's going to rain. So we would suggest that maybe you go a little bit later because we just pinged it to find out when the next time that you have that safe window of not getting wet. So this is kind of what it looks like. So I hit start walk, and instead of starting the actual walk like it normally would, it communicates with the Climacell API and comes back and says, well, your average walk is about 46 minutes, and there will be rain in your micro location in 46 minutes. So I choose to hit suggest, and then it'll go back to the API and say, well, if you leave at 8:18 a.m. instead, you'll be able to fit in a 46-minute walk without any precipitation. So again, I'll have links to all these different APIs on the site I'll give you at the end of the session. Now finally, and this is the demo that I will give you access to. This is an app. This is the book app that I was talking about before. The inception of this application came from me sitting at home, and I'm married to a very lovely bookworm, and I saw her in the back of the room one afternoon with a pencil and a clipboard writing things down on paper. And then I said to her, dear, what are you doing in the corner there? And she says, I'm creating a database inventory of all of my books on my bookshelf. And I stopped for a moment and realized, honey, I have a reputation here. I can't have any paper processes in this home. So I went ahead and I created this application, which she never used. But anyways, I'm using it as a demo here. So what I actually did with this one is I created this cool app, and you guys are going to have it. You can throw it on your phone and manage all your books as well. And so what happens is you hit the plus button and you want to add something. And I found out it's kind of hard to add data to a phone, right? Small little fields and everything. So I realized that we have the ability to scan barcodes, natively right on the phone. And then I realized that every book already has a barcode on it, right? ISBN numbers. Every book has an ISBN number. So I did a little bit of research, and I found an API that I'm going to show you, an unusually easy one to integrate. They're not usually like that, but I'll show you how this works. And I found out that I could grab an ISBN number, send it to the Google Books API, and it would send back a big chunk of JSON. I'll show you all this stuff in a second, but here's how it looks. And this is actually in real time, recorded in real time. I scan the back of the book, and that quickly, it actually populates all the fields with all that data. So an API helping me with data entry in this case. So you guys want to see how that works? All right, great. So first of all, you have to find the API. And while this API happens to be Google, you really start this process by Googling around. And you literally just Google, Climacell API or such and such API. And so, oh, yeah, don't want to do that. So hold on, power. Sorry, guys. So the Google one was actually pretty easy. When I first started working with this, it actually required that you had an API key. You'll run into that a lot. Some of them are fee-based, and some of them are free. It really depends on what what their business are. Google just wants you to send them your data, so they'll give it to you for free. So I looked up and I did a little bit of research, and what I found out was if I just compose a URL call, you remember from my first slide, I showed you the URL call and then the response. This is how easy this call is. If you look at this part of it, that stays the same every time we're making a request to the Google Books API. So all that stuff stays the same. I can just put that in, and I'll show you how I do that in FileMaker in a second. I'm sorry, it actually goes up to this little colon there. And then the rest of that, that's whatever the number is that we just scanned. So in plain English, we scan the number, put it into a field, and then construct this whole thing and send it out over to Google. And then what Google does is it comes back with all this information. This is a return in the format of JSON. We'll explore this a little bit further here in just a second. So now we figure out how we can make a request and what we get when we return. So let me show you when we get into FileMaker how the consumption of that will work. So here's that FileMaker database that I'm going to give you guys. And this is basically the script where all the stuff happens. So, and don't worry about it, you'll have your own copy, so you don't have to consume all this. But the very top of it is the insert from device, where I'm saying, I'm actually invoking the camera on my barcode and taking the photo. And then I commit that value, and I do some error checking and whatnot and check to make sure I'm online. But this is really where all the magic happens. So when we're communicating with APIs, we're going to do something called an insert from URL. So what this does, this will allow me to invoke the calculation engine to come up with this string. So I just take the hard-coded text and I put a placeholder on there for wherever I stored in this case, the ISBN number. The other part of this is, and in that case, you happen to see that I saved it inside of a field, but you don't have to save it inside of a field. As a matter of fact, while my approach here is a tad bit unorthodox, what I'm really doing in the insert from URL is I can say, hey, here's the URL, and whatever comes back, save it into a variable. See, I can choose which one of those fields I want to put it into, or I can just put it in a variable. So it's really up to you how you want to do that. I kind of did it in both in this case. So then after that point is you see all the set fields here. I'm using native JSON parsing functions to identify the data very quickly within that return JSON and put it into a FileMaker field. It's pretty easy. Let me walk you through those steps too. So I created this little layout here to kind of show you how this all works. So that thing that we were just looking at is the insert from URL. And then I can use this function. See where it says JSON get element? That's one of those new native functions that were introduced in the FileMaker platform just a couple versions ago. And in that case, I'm pointing to that JSON variable, and it says total items. So in FileMaker speak, that's really like found records. So what I'm saying is, does it equal one record? Because I'm only looking for one. If it doesn't equal one, it's probably more than what I'm looking for, and that might be an error. Or I could have just trapped for 0, and it said, well, I don't have any. It doesn't look like anything returned. But in this case, I do have one that returned, so I'm just going to continue. And while you don't have to store it in a field, I did it so you could see it, because you can't really see the stuff that's stored in variables. So the next thing I want to do is kind of format it. There's a couple of things, JSON format elements. There's stuff in this JSON, I guess, to simplify it, that maybe isn't necessary for the parsing exercises we're doing. So I'm going to actually go through a couple of these steps, and I'm going to clean it up just a tad. And in this case, I'm actually taking just the data I need. What I'm doing is I'm isolating just the record, so to speak, data. It's not really called that, but I want to speak FileMaker speak so you guys can kind of understand what's happening there. I isolate it down to just what you're looking at here. Now, if you look real closely, it's very human readable. But you see here this thing called e-tag. That's sort of what we know what would be a field label. And then the value next to it is actually the data that would be in the field. So we need to know what element it is that we're looking for in the name, because I want to take that data and put it into this field. Now, don't worry. I named the FileMaker fields the same thing as the JSON elements, but I just did that for the demo purposes. That's not important to this task. So what I'm going to do is then use a series of set field script steps that basically just say, go into the field, and the JSON get element, if you focus on that, it says, inside the e-tag field that you see on the left, go look inside the JSON field, find the element called e-tag, and go grab that data element and put it inside that field. And I just do that for every single one of the fields that are on here. So if you think you can figure out this part of it, this is kind of really the heaviest lifting for parsing this data out that it comes back from APIs. And then I do that a bunch of times, and voila. There you go. Oh, yes, of course, it's arrowing out. Naturally, it is. So, hold on. Let's clear it. We'll do it again just for posterity. But it would actually behoove us to make this seem difficult, and I'll tell you why in a second. So, so what you're supposed to do is get a bunch of errors in there. Don't worry about it. But boy, is this difficult. I wish there was an easier way to do this. Now, I'm kidding around a little bit, but there is an easier way. But let me be honest with you about something real quick here. Let's get real, kids. These things that I showed you, they're actually pretty cool. And a couple of them even worked. But what I want to be honest with you about is the level of effort that's involved here. I want to inspire you, and I want to get you really excited about this. But that homes file, let's just isolate the realtor file that we had there. That one took about 100 to 110 hours to develop that thing, okay? Now, the part that I wanted to share with you is that about 20 to 30% of that was just for the API integration stuff. Logging, formatting, building endpoints, the whole nine, or parsing out endpoints, the whole 9 yards. For some perspective, that is just the script that loaded the Zillow details over in the left-hand side area on that first demo that I showed you. So there's a lot going on there. So I'm really not trying to talk you out of this. Hold on, technical difficulties. I appear to be having a transmission from another room, or I think another space-time continuum. What is this? Sorry, I'm going to need some audio on that in the back there, but God damn. All right. I don't know what's happening. I think this is somebody next door that's doing this, but hold on. Let me get some actual audio going here. All right. Jeez. Okay, well, you're in luck. You don't have to sit through that. All right, well, okay, so not sure how to get audio working, but I think the joke's dead anyways, folks. Let's move on. Thank you. Well, I mean, I've never seen it before. I mean, I don't know what's happening. So basically, I'll just narrate you through this, I guess.
Hey everybody, this is Chris from the future. You know that thing Chris was just talking about? Well, I'm here to tell you that it gets way easier in the future. As a matter of fact, I can't wait for you guys all to hear about it. I put all the answers right here. And you know what? If I leave
that's what this
right
is.
now, I can probably get back in time for him to show you in his session. Take it from here, Chris.
Okay, I will. All right, I'm super confused. Well, apparently I've been to the future, and what I learned was that there's a way easier way to do this. a way easier way where things work every time you want them to work, and that the level of effort is significantly less. I think for those of you that were at the session earlier this morning, you heard me talk about pretty much this exact same demo I was talking about. It took about 35 hours to do a lot of the integration on that Homes one, and I'm going to walk you guys through how I actually made those connections in this new Claris Connect. Well, you heard how enthusiastic I was this morning, but I just wanted to reiterate, I really am excited about this. It was not a fake story this morning by any means. When I first got a hold of Claris Connect, I mean, in the future, I guess. When I first got a hold of Claris Connect, I don't really work too much on weekend evenings. I try to do a little bit of a work-life balance thing. But I sat down in my office and I hammered away at this for the whole weekend in a row. And the reason this was so cool to me is because I love APIs and I love extending FileMaker functionality. But generally what happens is, really cool idea, and then a few weeks later, you actually get to see the results of it. By that time, you're so maddened by the process that you just want it to work. But with this, with Claris Connect, I go, really cool idea, click, 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 oh my God, it works. And that's really contagious, that's really kind of addicting. So before I jump into it, I just want to call back to, I did a session a few years ago here, but at DevCon in general, where I was showing how to communicate from FileMaker to some other applications, one of which at the time was called Workflow.io. It's now Siri Shortcuts, and it's really that same kind of flow process. There's also applications out there called If This Then That. Anybody familiar with that? So if the concept of if this then that works for you, then you already know everything you need to know to make this work for you. So let me jump in and show you what I've got. And I just want to say thanks to the folks at Claris and my new friend Giuliano for getting me these logins. This was no small task. This was only a few weeks ago. And for all those guys to have their stuff ready by DevCon and to give me an opportunity to do this too was a lot of fun for me, and I can't wait to share this with you. So let's dive into this. How is it now easier to do this? Well, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to concentrate now. You've seen a lot of some visuals of this. I want to concentrate on how we prep our FileMaker files for this. So first of all, let me go into FileMaker and show you just the few steps that are necessary. I'm going to first remind you of the file that I created before, the Homes file. Let's take a look at the Homes file real quick. So the Homes file is this one. Remember this one? And this is where I actually added those 4 individuals to a list. So use your imagination along with me and think, well, we're not done with that story. We added those 4 individuals to a list, but what if they want to unsubscribe? That can be a very sensitive thing, right? So let's say somebody clicks on an email in the bottom of their in the bottom of the email that they received about this home, and they say unsubscribe. Now, MailChimp knows they're unsubscribed, but FileMaker doesn't. So what if all of a sudden I include them in another list against their wishes? So let's just look at what the FileMaker piece is. First of all, I have a field. I've only exposed it for the sake of this demo, but it's got a 1 in it. That means that they're actually subscribed to this list that they're on. So really, essentially what we want to do is have MailChimp go and update that field when they receive an unsubscribe. Does that make sense? Okay, so prepping FileMaker, there's really only one thing involved, or 2 things actually, I guess. So if we go into FileMaker and we go into Manage Security, we'll pick an active privilege set that actually has an account assigned to it. And I use the full access for this demo. And there's really 3 different extended privileges we need to have activated. First of all, the FM app, because this has to be hosted on FileMaker's server, a specific type as well. And then the next one, which usually trips people up, is the FM URL script, because the Claris Connect is going to be communicating back to this via URLs, much like I was showing you before. And then the final one is we want to turn on the FM REST, because that's how the communication comes out of FileMaker. That's where the data comes from. So after all that's set up, what we want to do then is create a layout. So those of you that have worked with custom web publishing before, or maybe other connections, know that because of FileMaker's, because of the fact that FileMaker is a fusion between the presentation layer and data layer, that if we want to communicate to the data layer, we have to go through a layout. And it's actually kind of good. It might seem a little wonky, but it's actually good, because this gives us a chance to establish the context of that data. So in this case, we want to communicate with the individuals, the buyers. So I go and I create a layout that's based on the context of buyers. And then the other thing it allows us to do is put a bunch of fields on there. I probably have 50 or 60 fields in the buyer layout, or the buyer table, but I only put 5 or 6 of them on the layout. So this helps us isolate just the fields that we want to communicate with. And that JSON there is just what it's going to look like when I send it over to FileMaker. I'll get to that in a second. So now that FileMaker's ready, we upload it to server, and a special kind of server that will have access to this. And then we open up, while it says Starling, this actually is Claris Connect. And now, with many caveats, this will probably look a lot different by the time you guys get to play with it, but I'm just happy that we can see any facsimile of it at the moment. So what you're looking at right now is my dashboard here, and I've got a bunch of projects on there. I like to kind of think of projects as sort of the file in FileMaker, right? And inside those projects, we're going to add things called flows. To me, the closest facsimile in FileMaker to a flow is like a script, and then we add actions to the script, and those are very similar to script steps, right? So a project can have many flows, and within each flow there can be several. There's a trigger and then several actions. Hopefully that makes sense and isn't too daunting. So now actually what we're going to do is we're going to create a new project, and I'm going to name this project. And the benefit of creating a project is there's going to be some connections that you're going to see me make here, and I only need to make them once per each flow inside the project. So if I want to connect to MailChimp for multiple different flows, I put them all in one project, and I don't have to keep connecting to them. So now what you're seeing, this is something familiar. You've probably seen a couple times today. What we have to do is start off with a trigger. And I asked for a show of hands on if this, then that, because the whole premise of that concept of if this, then that is what? The if part is what's your trigger? What's the event that's going to make the rest of the stuff happen? That's the same kind of mindset that you use when you're building in Claris Connect. So in my story, if you recall, my trigger is going to be that MailChimp has a user unsubscribed. So let's go ahead and pick MailChimp for my trigger. There's only one trigger per flow. And there I'm going to click the second one, the unsubscribed, and I'm going to hit continue. At this point, Claris Connect is connecting to MailChimp, but now I need to connect to my account on MailChimp. And I'll be honest with you, I spent more time, just to pause here, I spent more time going up and setting up fake accounts on all these different things in the demos I'm showing you than I spent actually creating the flows successfully to connect. True story. And that you just saw is what it took me to actually do the connection. And I don't mind saying, that was a good day and a half or 2 days worth of pulling my hair out just to make that work in the old version that I showed you. So now that I'm actually connected to my account, I have access to the different lists. And of course, we created a list in there for the Joneses. So what we're doing is, you see it says knocking on MailChimp's door. In this case, what I can do is actually pick one of those lists. So let's pick a list, pick the Joneses, because this is the list that we're waiting to see if somebody unsubscribes from, right? So now you see where it says toggle the user unsubscribed event in MailChimp. This is what's called a trigger test, or we want to test the trigger. That means when this trigger actually fires, we want to make sure it works. The other thing that's happening there, too, is we're actually going to get some data from MailChimp that we can use, as you'll see here, in one of these forms. So now I'm logged into my demo MailChimp account over on the right-hand side window. I'm going to pick one of these individuals, and I'm going to trigger one of those unsubscribe events. So now, Claris Connect, as you see on the left-hand side, is going to receive that and say, yep, well done. That was a nice affirmation, actually, that we just got there. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to name this flow, much like you would name a script, right, so that I know where it is when I see it later. And I'm going to call this one unsubscribed. So now that I have my flow and I have my trigger, it's time to add actions. So again, the actions are the things that happen after the trigger occurs. So the trigger here is user unsubscribed. And let's go in and pick some actions. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one of the FileMaker actions. And there's probably going to be a whole bunch of these by the time we actually get our hands on this. But what I want to do right now is edit an existing record. The story that I'm doing, I'll do another one in a few minutes, but I'm going to actually update an existing record in my database. So anytime you're updating existing records, you need to know a couple things about it. So you need to know the record ID. I'll get to that in a second, too. And that's kind of a custom web thing that you might have heard of in the past. So what I'm doing now is, because I picked FileMaker, I have to connect to a valid FileMaker account. I need to connect to a FileMaker Cloud account, a special type of one. I need to tell it what domain I'm communicating with, give it a username and password that has rights to do what I'm doing, and then spell out the database that I actually want to make the connection with. And then I hit save, and then Claris Connect goes and does its thing. Very much like I just connected to the MailChimp. It's the same kind of deal there. So now when I hit continue, now I can actually enter in which database on that server again. I enter in the database name. I tell it what layout, and really what we're doing when we're telling it the layout is we're saying what table do you want to communicate with and which fields. And that's the table, just to remind you. I put the exact syntax of the MailChimp API layout in there. And then now I go and I put that layout name in, and I will then add, in this case, a record ID, only because I'm editing an existing record. So when I actually had these records created in MailChimp, I was actually pushing FileMaker's record ID over so I could identify that specific record. But this, again, nothing new to Claris Connect. This is all stuff that you've done with APIs or web publishing. Now, what you're actually seeing is we're clicking into MailChimp. We're seeing all these different assets. Let's just call them fields. They're not really called that, but I want you guys to kind of, understand something that you've seen before. This is all data that we have available to us now that we've connected to MailChimp. So in my case, what I'm doing is I want to actually find the record ID of the individual who just unsubscribed. So I click that little record ID, and this cute little pill thing shows up there. It's very much like a placeholder. If you think of these fields that I'm editing in, these are really your calculation field area, and these pills are kind of like the field references that you put in there. You'll see a more dramatic example of that when I get to it in a second. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell it that I want that particular record ID, and then I'm going to actually give it a couple other values. In this case, I don't have to put a pill in there. I'm going to actually put the 0 in user is subscribed, because after all, what we're doing is connecting to that database, finding that record, and changing that value to 0. So now everything appears to be set up. I can actually go in and test. This is one of the cool things about Claris Connect, is I can test this connection. This is one of the things about APIs that's kind of difficult. And I get this test response, and I have green. That's always nice to see. And my status is 200, which means it was successful. I'm also going to go into FileMaker and test this. So let's move. First of all, I'm going to enable it, much like you would on a script, on a scheduled script on a server, for example. So now I'm going to actually open up FileMaker. I'm going to pick one of these records, and we'll check to see that this is actually working. Because as we saw the old way, sometimes it doesn't always work. So now I'm going to pick one of these individuals. We see that Elliot has a number 1. So I'm going to go pick Elliot, and then we're going to trigger that same user unsubscribed. We hit confirm, and 1 banana, 2 banana, 0. So it's kind of unspectacular, but there's a lot of really cool stuff going on there. And that applause is for Giuliano, by the way, because I did nothing there, actually. Now, that went pretty quick, right? Was that about, 34, 35 hours, maybe? It was actually very quick. This time I'm going to do one for speed. I'm going to do the opposite one, and we can see how quickly we can go through these steps. So we're going to do the opposite. Now, if somebody actually subscribes through MailChimp, and they're a record in our database, we want to go edit that they're subscribed. So I pop through these things. Notice I don't have to do another MailChimp authentication because basically I'd already done it within another flow in this project. And now I pick through that list again, doing that really quickly. And this is a recording, but I recorded this all in real time, just in case you're wondering. And now I actually find somebody who's needs to be subscribed. We're doing the opposite now, and I do resubscribe. This is just testing the trigger. So now the flow that I just created says, well done. Now this will actually work. The connection is made. We hit save, and I'm going to take some time and actually fill out, I'll name that, and I'll take the time to fill out a couple of these other things here too. So now we do the actions. And the actions, in this case, we're doing the same thing. We're editing. We're taking an existing record, and we're going to edit it. We're going to change the value. Instead of like we did before with 0, we'll change this one to 1. You notice that I did not have to authenticate against the FileMaker account, again, because this flow is in the same project as the other flow where I already did that. So that's very convenient as well. And I put in the name of the database, the name of the layout, and again, I'm going to go grab that pill for the record ID. But in this case, because the user is subscribing, I want to make sure that we have the latest email address for them because they have their own account and they could have changed it. I picked the record ID, but I'm also going to go down to the, then is subscribed, make that a 1, and go down to personal email, and I'm going to pull that pill in there for whatever the email was that they just resubscribed with, just to make sure that they didn't update it. I hit save. Oh, no, actually, yeah, we'll do that in a second. I'll show you something in a second. So now we enable it, and then let's go check the database again. We find this little guy here has been unsubscribed, so let's go pick his record and resubscribe him, and we'll see this thing happen again. And we'll do 1 banana, 2 banana. All right, great. How long did that take? Anybody timing me? That was about 30 hours, I think, actually. Well, that's what the invoice says. I'm just kidding, Christopher. All right, sorry. Now you know. Yes. So no secrets are safe here. All right, I'm going to dig just a tad bit deeper, actually. I'm going to do another flow here, and this time what I'm going to do is do it from FileMaker, okay? Because we're all excited about how we can trigger things from FileMaker, but the caveat that I want to share here is this is for sure not going to be how we're going to do this when this finally ships and you get it in your hands. Right now, what I have available to me, well, first of all, you see I have that field. I also have a button on there, and it's running a FileMaker script. So let me show you the FileMaker script. This is going to be similar to the type of thing that you're going to be doing. I have a script in here that says, is the individual record that we're on, have they already subscribed? If so, then go compile this data and do something. If not, do something else. It's basically saying if they show unsubscribed, then go tell MailChimp to make them unsubscribe. But if they show subscribe, go tell MailChimp to make them subscribe. So what we're doing here is, let me show you that set variable. This is the way that I can actually create a payload. I can actually use the JSON set element and reference all these different fields and create a big block of data that I can then send over to Claris Connect. That will then allow Claris Connect to display these values for me in those drop-downs so I can pick pills for them. But down here at the end, you see there with the curl options, that's where I'm actually putting the JSON data variable. You see that as one of my curl options. It's pretty simple. It's a lot of copying and pasting. But what I need is a webhook. What I'm using in this technique is I'm using a webhook as a trigger. Webhooks will still persist. There's definitely ways you can have other things run a URL. Basically, if some other thing can run a URL, then you can integrate it with Claris Connect. Right now, what I had available to me is that Claris Connect, or FileMaker could run a webhook to do the connection, so that's what I'm choosing. So one of the things with webhooks is that you need to create a hook. When I went to the Google API, they told me in their documentation what the URL was supposed to be, but I'm going to create a custom one and connect. That's basically what's happening here. So what I have to do, though, is trigger that. So what I'm going to do is go back into my FileMaker script, and I'm going to now add that URL, and I'm just going to test run this script. And it's going to do two things. It's going to test the trigger and give me that connection, and also pass that payload of JSON data over so I have something to work with over on the Claris Connect side. So now you see there it says send a request, an HTTP request, and it's going to allow us to go through that very quickly. Now we're back into Claris Connect. And so I'm going to name this quickly here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say when this trigger is received, basically when another application sends this URL, what do I want to have happen? That's what the actions are here. So I want to show you some if-else options that we've got. This is one of the cool things about Claris Connect. What you're not seeing, it's just some rendering thing. Don't worry, it's been addressed. But I'm just putting some notes to myself. This is very much like when you guys create a script that has an if in it. You say if, and then put a test in there. And this is me writing the test. Just like I said before in Claris Connect, you actually put those pills as field references. And then we use these operators. It's very similar to when we're doing the test portion in the calculation window in FileMaker. And we say, if that value equals 1, then go do something. That means if the value in the database record equals 1, then go capture another action. So in this case, that additional action that you see there is going to be the MailChimp. So we're going the other direction. We've updated something in FileMaker. We've updated the field in FileMaker, and we want to go update the same record in the MailChimp account. So now we're going into MailChimp, and we're picking the list, and all this other good stuff shows up that you see here. But this is where it gets kind of fun, because not only am I putting these pills in, and what it may have seen before, like I was just mapping fields, but and then, of course, our first name and our last name, because we're actually creating it. We're assuming this record exists in FileMaker, and it never existed over in MailChimp. So there's the record ID. All this information that you see is happening here. We've got, in this case, because of the if-else, we're actually just using one flow to do one of two things. It could do many different things, but in this case, we didn't need a flow for unsubscribe and a flow for subscribe. I'm putting stop actions in there. It's the same principle as putting an exit script in your scripts. Sometimes you need them, sometimes you don't. Probably in this example, I didn't need them because there's no other actions in the flow that follow this, but just to kind of let you know some of the other things that are available. So I do another if in there. And in this case, we'll end up doing the opposite. So in this case, if subscribed equals true, then go into MailChimp and subscribe them to the list. In the other case where I'm setting up, it's simply saying if they're not subscribed, then actually you can go in and find a record and make them not subscribed. So let's take a look at Great. Let's do a little test on this. So this is what it looks like when it's done. You see I'm putting the stop in there. Let's just do a quick test inside FileMaker. So I'm going to go and find a record that's not already in MailChimp. I've assigned that button. I assigned the script to the button there, but we'll go find a record that's not in MailChimp. How about just Jeremiah 1? And then we're going to run the script, just like you know how to run scripts. And then we're going to communicate with Claris Connect. And you see right there that it added a record by running a script in FileMaker. Super easy. And now, as you can see there, we just saw Jeremiah then get removed at the same time. And all I had to do was refresh those things. So we can do this in both directions, from FileMaker or from the other API source. So, but wait, there's more. Let me show you a couple other quick things that I played around with that I think will inspire you. First of all, I was playing around a little bit with this, and I actually saw something on Twitter where somebody had said, oh, I'm going to connect to the Google Maps API so I can grab latitude and longitude, like sort of maybe something a plugin or a microservice might do. But in this case, I've got this record, I built the database, and what I want to do is I've already created these flows. They're going to communicate through a webhook so I can trigger the script in FileMaker to go look into Google Maps and then send the address over to Google Maps. You'll see here in a second after I establish the confirmation of the webhook. Some of this is the same as what you've seen. But take a look at this part. See how the field I put in there? Again, it's not a field. It's actually kind of like a calculation area. I put a bunch of different pills in there. So I'm saying send all these different field values over to Google. And then when Google tells me finds those in their system, then take the lat and long. You see those pills look a little bit different because those are actually coming over from Google Maps. So I'm saying take this address, send it to Google Maps, go find out what the lat long is, come back, and then put those into the record, the same record that we built there in the first place. So now you see I run that, and it populates those fields. So you can use this almost like a plugin or a utility that your users don't even need to see is actually happening. The last one that I'm going to share with you here is another example. If you remember the story before where Bob was creating that asset and then sending it over to Susan for approval, well, here is actually a way where when I'm using a box trigger in this case. So I'm going to finish that story by saying, now the client has received this file, and they've downloaded it from their special client folder, and now we want to send an email back to Susan to say, yep, the client received it, because we want to make sure that we got it on time and that they didn't have any problems. So the trigger that I'm using is box, and the trigger there was when the file was downloaded from a specific folder, and then I'm using Office 365 to have an action, which is sending a custom email. And if you look at what I've done here in that email body, it's a combination. Again, this is more like a calculation window than field mapping. It's a combination of text and a bunch of different pills that are coming up with this message. So I'll show you the quick test of what this looks like. So at the end, So this is the box account there with the client folder. Down there is a Outlook browser. I simply trigger the action that was I trigger the download. It downloads that file that you saw before and automatically sends an email there in the bottom right-hand corner. In that case, it doesn't even involve FileMaker. Okay? I could add an edit record at the end of that if I wanted to. So while I know there might be some anxiety and nerves about what do you mean it doesn't involve FileMaker, I want you guys to get excited about the extending your existing FileMaker apps, because there's a whole new universe of functionality. You're going to be heroes when you go back to your customers and your bosses and say, oh yeah, you know what we can do now? Basically everything, right? So get ready to be busy. But these are just some of the connectors that you're going to see when you get your hands on Claris Connect. The other part, too, is I want you to think about it without any fear. I want you to think about flows and how they might value your customers with their automation. In this case, this is a flow example where, let's say somebody signs a contract in DocuSign. It goes into a CRM, updates it, and marks that as closed, then uses Slack to communicate much in the manner that I showed you before. Here's another one where it can go into DocuSign, sign a contract automatically, update the individual in the CRM, communicate with QuickBooks to send an invoice, go back to the CRM, say what the invoice number was, then send that invoice over to the customer. That's pretty outstanding, right? So some of the advantage, yes, and I'm applauding right along with you. That's good stuff. So you may be wondering, what are some of the differences with this between some of the other applications that you've seen that might be similar? Well, first of all, that if-then-else logic is a big deal. Code blocks. You're going to hear a lot more about code blocks. This whole thing, Claris Connect, is based on Node.js, which means that if you can author or have one of your friends' kids can author JavaScript, then you're going to be able to extend this beyond what you can ever imagine. Wait till you see what some of the crazy speakers and future DevCons are going to be able to do with that. You can build new APIs on top of others, and AI integrations. Yes, they promised us in the future machines would take over the world. Well, now they're taking over FileMaker stuff, too, with Claris Connect. Really cool stuff there in error handling. You saw some of this stuff before. I think here's my parting message for you guys. Oh, all right. I've been to the future. So, here we go.
It means your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one. Both of you.
Oh, that's such a good message. So guys, get excited about that. The future is coming. It's part of it's here right now. I want you to be enthusiastic and have fun with this. Go to FileMaker and APIs.com at your leisure. You will find all videos for all this if you want to share it with some folks back at the office, and a link to every one of the APIs that I integrated with those demos earlier, and a bunch of other cool stuff that's on there too that's all pertaining to FileMaker and APIs. I look forward to chatting with you guys in the halls about this stuff. Good luck and happy future, everybody.